So this research is my dissertation research. Before I get started, I have to give a big shout out to my academic partner in crime, Yashika. We did kind of our dissertations together. We collected data together, and so we'll be able to kind of collaborate on future research. But she was my sanity through this whole process. This research really looks at, because of who I am, and the research questions were asked in that way, is because of who you are. And then, so because of who I am and my self-efficacy, how do I relate that with discrimination, specifically that I perceive, that I experience, and then kind of major discrimination that I've experienced throughout my life. So we're looking at the person themselves in terms of the questions and how they are asked. We decided to go with the use of skin tone, just because race can be very convoluted, I guess, especially when you have multiple classifications. We wanted to look at skin tone specifically, because when you walk up to somebody, you don't automatically know their race. That's easily mistaken, but skin tone is something like, I'm very white, I'm very, very pasty. So that's something that is automatic, that you know and that you see. So the three major variables that we're looking at are intersectionality and self-efficacy and skin tone. And then I also looked at sexual orientation, gender, and age, just for some demographics. So intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, 1989, 1991-ish. And this particular theory I find almost mind-blowing, because you are taking the whole identity of the person, and you're taking that identity and saying, how do the multiple social constructs in my identity affect who I am and how I'm perceived through the world? So you're not just looking at whether you're male, female, whether you are non-binary, whether you're gay, you're straight. You're not just looking at one thing, you're looking at the whole person. And when we experience things in the world, we don't experience it just from a female perspective or just from a straight perspective. We experience it from our entire perspective. And that's what intersectionality allows us to do, is look at things from the entire perspective. We use self-efficacy because with the research, what we know is that self-efficacy derives us in our abilities. So in terms of our overall abilities, how do I believe in myself, and how am I going to be able to succeed in the world? So our self-efficacy affects abilities, our affective, emotional state, our motivation, our cognitive processes, how we select things in the world. And our self-efficacy can be gained through our mastery of topics vicariously, so by watching others and repeating it, and then also through social persuasion. And so self-efficacy basically can be attained just through our general experiences and through our experiences throughout our existence. When we look at skin tone, we look at the genetic makeup of the person when we're looking at skin tone. So there are a couple of different types of skin tone. We have eumelanin, which is sort of the blackish brown type of melanin. And then we have pheomelanin, which is the reddish or yellow type of pigmentation. Our genetic makeup for our skin tone also affects our eye color and our hair texture. And so when we're looking at skin tone, we move from skin tone to a process of colorism, which basically is discrimination based on the hue of our skin. So discrimination based on essentially not being white and pasty, which breaks down even to a simpler facet of discrimination based on the fact that you produce too much melanin, or a more melanin than a white person. So the problem that I sort of constructed is, what does this look like? And what does it look like through an intersectional lens? We have a bunch of research that looks at the problem of discrimination with skin tone and how that affects us through race, or we look at it through gender, or maybe one or two different variables, but we don't come at it from the perspective of our whole self. And so that's what I really wanted to do, is help to fill this gap. In terms of using quantitative methods, that was another gap that I wanted to fill, because intersectionality is often looked at from a qualitative sense, and there was little to zero research from a quantitative sense. And the method that I used for this was actually constructed and validated just a couple of years ago. So it's a fairly new way to look at intersectionality. Further, when we're looking at this, discrimination is just not a one variable problem. So when you experience discrimination, it just doesn't stay in the race section of your brain, or the skin tone section of your brain, or the gender section of your brain. You experience this completely within yourself as your whole self, which impacts how we exist within the world. It impacts our emotional selves, it impacts our physical selves. And then what I also wanted to do is provide a rationale for how this works within sort of a public or private sector. When looking at the literature, I had to sort of extrapolate from the individual, or like the one or two social construct of discrimination. And what the kind of one or two construct discrimination research says is that there are a host of issues that we experience when we experience discrimination. So we have psychological effects. We have an increased likelihood of depression, anxiety. We also have an increased likelihood of things like heart disease, diabetes. For the Black populations, you have a significantly higher risk of death while you're giving birth, or your baby dying, because in the medical field, oftentimes the requests, or the, hey, I feel like something is wrong, is not really taken seriously within the darker skin tone community. This also affects our immigration status. And what I mean by that is not necessarily whether you're a citizen or not, but it affects our perception of how we look at immigrants, and also how immigrants feel about coming into the United States. So oftentimes there's sort of I call it a honeymoon phase of, wow, I'm in the United States, this is great. And then they start to see and experience the discrimination because they're different. And then that goes away, and then it impacts your psychological sense, and oftentimes your physical self. So again, you can have increased likelihood of heart disease, diabetes. And so it all just kind of snowballs. It impacts our perception of higher education. So for our minority students, how the discrimination that they experience impacts even the likelihood of them attempting higher education. It also affects their likelihood of attempting, going, and then succeeding. Our discrimination affects safety. So specifically for Black and not straight classifications, your likelihood of being sexually assaulted increases significantly within that particular population. And then this also increases our perception, so how we perceive discrimination. And oftentimes what the research has shown is that we have an increased perception of discrimination, almost like a heightened awareness. Self-efficacy, from what the research suggests, when it is paired with something else. So self-efficacy on its own is great in terms of mitigating the effects of discrimination. But when you pair it with something else, such as mentorship, ethnic socialization, increased self-esteem, or if you have protective factors such as your family, those situations will decrease the likelihood of the effects of discrimination. So having high self-efficacy is great, but it really has an impact when when it's paired with something else. So a teacher that cares, having a parent that's involved in your life, having other people that look like you around you, because just that particular thing can be a very isolating instance. It's also when you pair self-efficacy with something else, it decreases the likelihood of psychological effects of discrimination, specifically when you have a double minority status, meaning that you are not white and you're a member of the alphabet mafia, or LGBTQIA, depending on how you want to say it. So self-efficacy becomes very important when we're talking about discrimination and mitigating the effects of it. When we look at skin tone as it relates to colorism, we know that our skin tone has a very large impact on our existence. So in terms of health, as I previously stated, you have increased likelihood of early deaths, heart attacks, diabetes. The darker you are, research shows, the stronger the punitive punishment you will have. There's a research study that looked at the white criminals versus darker skinned criminals who had the same point system on their record and had virtually the same offenses. And the darker you were, the higher the likelihood of you being imprisoned or jailed for at least double the time of a white person. Colorism also affects within your minority status. So meaning that when you don't have somebody that looks like you, when you don't have somebody that is within your ethnic group, you lose that sense of yourself. You lose that part of yourself. And so oftentimes that particular instance can almost be double isolating because you've lost that sense of yourself. You don't necessarily know who you are because you don't fit in here, but you also don't feel like you fit in here. So you kind of go through life in a state of conundrum, basically. And so again, we know that from what the research shows, that discrimination has an impact, but we know that from a one or two social construct type of viewpoint. We don't know that from the whole self. And so that was the goal of this research, is to look at the whole self. So my overall hypothesis is, how does the whole self relate to self-efficacy as it relates to participants' skin tone? So what does self-efficacy impact the discrimination they face based on our whole self? Similar to previous research, does it mitigate or moderate the impact of discrimination and how we feel? In terms of the methodology, I used 3 different scales plus some demographic variables. I used the Intersectional Discrimination Index. This was created by Sheeman Bauer in 2019. It took them about 10 years to create it. And they have 3 different subsections. They have anticipated discrimination, they have day-to-day discrimination, and major discrimination. And all of the questions were worded because of who I am. So we are taking the whole self, not just the female self or the male self or the white self or the darker skin self or the Native American indigenous population self. We're taking the whole person. And so the questions ask, for example, because I am who I am, a nurse or doctor or some type of healthcare professional has treated me poorly. Or because you are who you are, you've heard people or other people talking about you, or you've been denied housing. And so again, looking at the whole self. This was a Likert scale from 0 to 4. I did change some of the scoring to fit my research study better. I did some pre-analysis to ensure that sometimes when you change the scoring from a 0 to 1 or 2 to 3, it will weigh heavily. And so you'll get sort of invalid hypotheses results. So I did some of that to make sure that the instrument still stayed valid, and it did. So that was a blessing. The self-efficacy measure that I used was also a Likert scale. It was a very general scale, 10 questions, short, sweet, and to the point. Because I was partnering with somebody, we had almost 80 questions in our survey, and I didn't want to add any more to that. We used the new immigrant survey, which for the skin tone, which basically has 10 hands, and they go from light to darkest. And so the participant picked the hand that looks most like themselves on a sort of a regular basis. We did change the wording to say yourself on a regular basis, because we know, the question was brought up, well, what if people tan? So right now they're darker versus, and they're that way for 3 months out of the year. So that's why we use that particular language. We also looked at age, gender, and sexual orientation. There was a bit of a struggle with how to word gender and sexual orientation. With APA formats, there between gender and sexual orientation, there were over 150 different ways to classify yourself. And I wanted to keep this as simple as possible. So after some talking with my dissertation chair, we settled on, for gender, male, female, or however, like write in how you want to identify yourself. And then for sexual orientation, straight, not straight, and then or if none of those fit you, write in how you identify. So that I wanted to make sure that it was simple enough to run the analysis, but also ensure that I was meeting everybody's, standards and expectations. I didn't want anybody to feel left out or isolated because they didn't have something that matched them. So the basic research question was, is there a relationship between intersectional discrimination, anticipated, day-to-day, and major, with generalized self-efficacy and skin tone? We anticipated a somewhat normal distribution, which you'll see in a minute was not normal. So these are our anticipated measures that we used, and then I'll explain why I changed them in the next couple of slides. But I looked at the relationships between perceived skin tone, self-efficacy, and intersectional discrimination. And then I wanted to know, does self-efficacy moderate the relationship between skin tone and intersectional discrimination? Because I wanted to see, is it something that just kind of goes alongside of you and sort of driving you in a parallel sense, or does it literally impact it and change the direction of your self-efficacy or the discrimination that you face and that you feel and that you take on? Excuse me. So I also looked at the relationship between age, skin tone, self-efficacy, and intersectional discrimination. And then I looked at gender differences and sexual orientation differences. You'll see here that I list ANOVA as what I used for the differences. That was changed. ANOVA is strong and sturdy enough to use a non-normal distribution if it's slightly abnormal, but when it's really abnormal, it's not quite as strong as I would like it to be. So we went with the Wilcox differences model. Okay, sexual orientation. We used G-Power to calculate the number of participants that I would need. The highest one was 159. We ended up with 440 participants. And we surveyed anybody over the age of 18 that lived in the United States who had a computer. And then we recruited through email, Facebook contacts, Instagram, LinkedIn, basically any social media that my IRB would allow me to use. This is an example of the anticipated intersectional discrimination survey. So again, the questions are because you are who you are. And they provide directions of this includes your self and how others might see you. For example, religion, gender, sexuality, age, weight, disability, mental health issue, income, ancestry, nationality. So it really takes the whole self, or as much of the whole self as we can. Example of the self-efficacy measure, again, 10 questions. It's kind of short, sweet, and to the point. But it's supposed to cover everything from optimism to belief in abilities and so on. This is our skin tone scale that we used. Again, 1 being the lightest, up to 10 being the darkest. And this way, we kind of felt like we could avoid any sort of issues with perception. So for example, someone might see me as number 1, but I see myself as number 2. This really says, okay, which one are you? And you could kind of have like a good solid pick. All right, so we ended up with 442 participants, but 2 of them had to be tossed because they did not sign consent. I have a strict rule about consent. If they don't say, yes, I approve, I can't use it. So that's how we ended up with 440. I used list-wise deletion because some people answered, almost all of the questions except for 1. Some people missed like 2 or 3 of them. So that was the easiest way to calculate the data, is just let SPS do that for me. Anything that was coded as non-applicable was coded as missing. Non-applicable really wasn't necessary for my survey, but for my dissertation partner's survey and her results, it was applicable. So I just added it to my questions. So here we have for self-efficacy and anticipated intersectional discrimination. We've got 440 participants. For day-to-day intersectional discrimination, 438, 439, and then again 438. You can see the means. Our mean self-efficacy was actually pretty high. So your score could be anything from 0 to 40, and so this was the average. And then for we were really heavy on the very white, pasty people side of things. So our mean for the skin tone was just over 2. And our means for anticipated intersectional discrimination day-to-day and major were relatively in the middle. So they weren't too terribly surprising, at least in that regard for me. We were very heavily weighted towards the female side of things. We had 381 females, 53 males, and then 6 who classified as other. And what the write-in was non-binary, gender fluid, or queer. For sexual orientation, we're very heavily weighted towards the straight side of things. Not straight was 37, and the other classification, the write-ins were pansexual, bisexual, or asexual, and then I had 6 missing. So we were very heavy female and straight in this particular study. So you can see our reliability. In the middle is previous research reliability. For whatever reason, they didn't calculate the reliability scores for day-to-day intersectional discrimination and major discrimination, which I asked the creators of the survey, and they said for themselves and their requirements, what they found with anticipated intersectional discrimination was enough for them. I went ahead and calculated them for my study, and everything is above the acceptable range. For reliability, you want anything above 0.64-ish, but if really you want to hit the 0.7 mark in terms of reliability. So we used Spearman's Row, the Cruxell-Wallace test, and regression to analyze the data. You can see here that we do have some extreme outliers in terms of our Z-scores for self-efficacy, a few for day-to-day intersectional discrimination, as well as a few for major discrimination. Major discrimination, we had the most outliers. And you can see here that our data is not normal at all, not even close. For our anticipated intersectional discrimination, and then just a viewpoint of it. All right, so research question 1. What is the relationship between self-efficacy, skin tone, and anticipated intersectional discrimination. Anything that has a double asterisk was valid at a 0.01 level, and anything with a single asterisk was valid at 0.05, so 95% efficiency. So we know that we have a negative relationship between anticipated intersectional discrimination and self-efficacy, meaning that as self-efficacy goes up, the anticipated intersectional discrimination score goes down. So what we perceive in the world, how we anticipate it, they have an inverse relationship. We know that with skin tone, self-efficacy has a positive relationship, meaning that they both go up together. So as for this particular study, as self-efficacy went up, our skin tone also went up. It's basically just saying those with the darker skin tones had probably greater self-efficacy than those with lighter skin tones. For anticipated intersectional discrimination, we have a positive relationship. So as the skin tone got darker, the anticipated intersectional discrimination score went up. Same thing with day-to-day intersectional discrimination. Interestingly, it was not statistically significant with major intersectional discrimination. So I thought that was particularly interesting. Question 2, does self-efficacy moderate the relationship between skin tone and intersectional discrimination? It does not at all. What we did find is that it's most likely when you just run the regressions as predictor variables, self-efficacy was more like a predictor variable than it was to moderate the relationship. After doing this particular research, I was informed that finding a significant moderating relationship is kind of a 1 in a million type thing. So not finding it, I guess, was not abnormal, I guess. So, and you can see the moderating relationship is the very last one in each of the boxes. So they're not even close to significant. Looking at the relationships with age and skin tone, we can see that self-efficacy again has an inverse relationship with age. There's negative relationships with age and anticipated discrimination in day-to-day. Nothing with major intersectional discrimination or skin tone. So what this tells us, at least from this particular slide, is that as age increases, anticipated discrimination, how we perceive that goes down. Also, as age increases, the day-to-day discrimination that we experience also goes down. Looking at gender differences as well as differences with sexual orientation, the findings, at least with gender, there was nothing statistically significantly different, which was puzzling to me. I reran it at least 5 times and got the same results. So there was no statistically significant difference between gender classification and intersectional discrimination, whether it is anticipated, day-to-day, or major. For sexual orientation, I found overall statistically significant differences between sexual orientation and anticipated intersectional discrimination. When looking at straight versus not straight, that was a statistically significant difference. Also with straight versus other, we have a statistically significant difference in sort of our perceptions of discrimination and how we take that in. With day-to-day, we have an overall significance, but when looking deeper, the only difference was between straight and other. With sexual orientation and major discrimination, we have overall statistical significance, and then the only difference was between straight and other classifications. I also did a bunch of exploratory work, looking at whether age moderates the relationship between skin tone and intersectional discrimination. It does not. Also, similar to self-efficacy, more of a predictor variable. So kind of going along side by side versus a direct type of impact. I also controlled for various factors. So controlling for age, gender, and sexual orientation. What does the relationship between skin tone, self-efficacy, and intersectional discrimination look like? It's pretty similar to before. The only difference that I thought was interesting here is that self-efficacy and skin tone, we have an inverse relationship before, and now we have a positive relationship. So basically what this tells us is that those demographic variables do have some type of impact on the relationship itself. I also did exploratory analysis with skin tone. So I grouped them. Anything that was skin tone, if you picked a 1 or a 2 on the hand, was a group. 3 through 5, and then 6 through 10 was also a group. Again, overall significance was found between skin tone and the groups of skin tone and anticipated intersectional discrimination. And you can see the difference between group 1 and group 2, also group 1 and group 3, but no difference between group 2 and group 3, meaning that sort of medium skin tone and the darkest skin tone didn't have any difference, but there was major differences between the lightest and the middle and the lightest and the most extreme. Okay, and then I did this again for day-to-day. And again, with this one, we have significance between groups 1 and 2, and then groups 1 and 3, and then we also have differences between groups 2 and 3. So basically what this tells us is that there are differences between how people experience day-to-day discrimination based on skin tone when they're a group. There are statistically significant differences in how they experience that. Then also with major, borderline with the, we have decent significance here. And then the only statistically significant difference within this one was between the most extreme groups, which would be the lightest and the darkest people. So basically what this says is that there is a difference between how those with the lightest skin tones and those with the darkest skin tones experience major discrimination, which is kind of, I don't want to say obvious, but it's in line with research. Let's see, I believe this was an accidental double. Okay, and then again, controlling for other factors. We note that there is just looking at skin tone and discrimination, as well as just self-efficacy and discrimination, controlling for those other variables. We do have some significant factors. So the questions sort of remain as, what does all of this mean? So we know that we're heavily weighted female. We know that we're heavily weighted straight. Our mean age is about 47, and we're heavily weighted towards the lighter skin tones. In terms of how this correlates with other research, the results with darker skin tone and anticipated discrimination are in line with previous research. Same thing with skin tone and day-to-day discrimination, as well as skin tone with self-efficacy. What was not in line with the research was age. So it was mixed. So some research says that age, the older you get, the less you perceive or the less discrimination you experience. And some research says it just continues throughout your entire life. So this may be completely population dependent. It's a kind of a mixed bag in terms of the age and intersectional discrimination. In terms of the moderating results, this was not in line with research at all. Previous research does show some type of moderating effect, meaning a direct effect between self-efficacy and discrimination. Again, this could be because we're so heavily weighted towards the very light population. And so, I mean, obviously, looking at this through maybe a more diverse lens might warrant different types of results. It's still completely baffling that there was no statistically significant differences with gender. I'm still, I guess, kind of my mind is blown still with that. So some of the strengths of the study, we had a huge sample size. That was sort of, I guess, the coolest part of this was getting that big sample size. It's a strength that it's quantitative, but it's also a weakness because quantitative gives us numbers. It tells us statistically significant findings, but we don't get to the meat of it. We don't get to talk to people and say, why is this? Why do you feel like this? What was the mindset with answering this particular question? So although it's a strength because there's not a lot of quantitative intersectional discrimination research out there, I would also group this as a weakness. One of the other strengths with this research is that we're looking at discrimination from the whole person's viewpoint. So you could count this as a strength or a weakness. In my opinion, it is a strength because we're not just parceling out a part of somebody, because that's not how we exist. We don't exist as, female for, 1 hour of the day and then white for another hour of the day. We exist as our whole selves. So that was at least a plus to me with this research. Again, it's kind of a limitation because the discrimination index is new. There's not, I believe I was the second or third person to use this index. So it definitely warrants continued use and continued validation. Also, these are self-report measures. So we're relying on the honesty and of the participants. We are relying on them to give honest answers versus kind of what they think we want to hear. This research was also done in the middle of our pandemic. It was completed about a year ago today, at least getting the stats gathered. So we're at a very tumultuous time in our history. And so that could potentially have impact on the results. There's a lot I would love to do in terms of future research. I really want to dig into self-efficacy and perceived discrimination because, and I have to say this with a big asterisk, how we feel and how we perceive things directly impacts how we feel about ourselves. And whether or not our perceptions are accurate, that's not the point. The point is how we look at the world. And so our lens is particularly important when looking at the relationship with self-efficacy. And then also how that relates to other places in the world and other types of institutions. I definitely want to dive into gender and intersectional discrimination and how gender and sexual orientation overlap. So one of the things that I noticed when people were writing in the other categories is that some of the other classifications that I knew to be either gender or sexual orientation were sort of flip-flopped. So I'm wondering how those two work together and whether it's accurate to consider them just on their own, or if we should consider them on their own and sort of a blended look if possible. And then just continued use of looking at discrimination from its whole self, not just our race or not just our gender. So what does this mean for us? As educators, at least to me, this means everything. So whether you're working in high school, whether you're working in kindergarten, middle school, whatever it is, university level, our students' self-efficacy is directly related to what they perceive. There's a strong relationship there. We know that. And so it is important that when we are looking at students and we're looking at the environment, that we're doing our best to look at it from a whole lens and not just our lens. Really asking, student A, what does this mean to you? How can I assist in ensuring that the lens that you see of our institution is the best lens it can be. The other area that we want to consider is what the risk factors are, specifically for minority students. And so I had a student once who, her upbringing was from Uganda, and her mother passed in the middle of a semester. And with that, I kind of had a couple of choices in how I looked at that. I could say, okay, I'm going to leave it up to her to let me know when she's ready to come back. Let me know, how she wants to get caught up. But I tried to look at it from the lens of if I were her, what would I want? And how could I reduce the risk factors of depression, anxiety? How could I reduce the risk factors of traveling, impacting education? How can I reduce the risk factors of just death all the way around and how that impacts my life? So understanding her cultural background, understanding the impact the death had on her, understanding the process of death from that particular cultural framework. Again, trying to look at it from the whole student's perspective, not just the fact that she's a student and, her education is up to her. So those are the two main things that at least I see to be particularly important when looking at sort of intersectionality, discrimination, or risk factors within our educational setting. So again, making sure that we are looking through a complete lens from our perspectives and the students. And then also, how can we reduce risk factors for our students that may not understand our educational system? Their cultural background is different from ours, so we might not understand how how they grieve, or their mental processes. We don't understand how their culture impacts their day-to-day. So those would be, again, the two main things that could be taken away from this particular research. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions, comments.
Dr. Carpenter.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I really took to heart the notion of self-efficacy, and that kind of led me to the cultural protective factors that exist within whichever community or population you're working with. And I found it interesting, about the pairing and, and some of the work that we're doing with our Indigenous students, particularly with this behavioral health. There are multiple elements of how we're, doing the pairing and, seeing, even just, and I'm sure Dr. Neely or Dr. Pretty Paint or others can offer some insights, but your research is fascinating because you came at it from a kind of quantitative lens, which is for me that's hard to wrap my head around because I feel like you missed some pieces, but you spoke to that in your research, so I found that fascinating. So anyway, I don't have a question for you, but I just want to say I was fascinated by the work you did on just skin color,
Thank you.
And how oftentimes that is a factor in, whether it's from my perspective because my skin color is X and somebody else's, that really, I think there are elements that you really raise that are relevant to the work that we do. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we are near the end of our time, but There were a couple of comments in the chat. I don't know if those who wrote in the chat have want to just speak for a moment to what they had to say.
I have a question if there's a pause and it's something that is short that Dr. Carpenter, you can think about. That struck me when you talk about the perceived discrimination lessening with age. So that kind of self-efficacy either rising up in a positive way to cover any kind of discriminatory patterns that may be offensive. Maybe you've navigated that successfully. But my question is a binary question, which is always more complicated, is that do you feel like it's an adaptive behavior, this reduction in discrimination perception with age, or do you feel like it's more of a hopelessness, a tiresome pattern of code switching, possibly in multiple populations? I just had that question on the age efficacy and discrimination being less perceived as people grow older. Thank you.
So I don't think I have a good answer for you. I definitely think it could be both. And that's one of the things that could definitely be explored. I wish I would have had the foresight to add sort of couple qualitative questions in there so that I could better, dig deeper, because numbers only give us so much. But I definitely think that both are a huge possibility. I mean, yeah, definitely both.
Thank you.
Dr. Carpenter, this is Dr. Pretty Paint, and I have just a couple comments. And I too would have welcomed the addition of what was mentioned in the chat box. In the family education model, we were looking at, the role of family and how that was connected to, of course, we were looking at retention. But you made me think of a couple things that we did. It caused us to do a paradigm shift in our expression of at risk. So we came up with at promise. And that's what I think in education, that we have to train ourselves to think about where that came from, that phrase. And it came from a deficit approach to behavioral health, overall health. And yet in education, the risk factors are things that emerge from your culture. And you made me think of so many things here, because I think skin tone is fascinating. I know it functions in my culture in very unique ways. And so I have people that are probably the same skin tone as you, and they have blue eyes and blonde hair, and yet they speak fluently our language, and they participate in a lot of our ceremonies. And yet if you met them and you thought of your perception, you could be very wrong. And then on the other hand, you have people that are from our culture that are what we call dark complected. And you would say, oh, that is somebody that must be grounded in their traditional way of life. And yet they could have been adopted out. They could have not been raised in the community, or not, nobody taught them very much. So I just think that's really powerful. I like the word at promise, and you can call them, protective factors. Mm-hmm. So instead of things putting you at risk, I like to think about what kinds of assessments can we make of students to think differently about what makes them strong.
Absolutely. I mean, just that shift in mindset itself. So in addition to teaching at Heritage right now, I work with pregnant and parenting teens. This is a demographic that is oftentimes very stigmatized. And I want to say humiliation is unfortunately a big part of that particular subgroup of people. And one of sort of the things that I work with them on is mantras every day and focusing on what makes them strong. And then with those strengths, how can you use that to work on what we need to work on? Everybody has deficits, and trying to shift that viewpoint. And I like your mindset of, if we shift our viewpoint to here are our strengths and how can we use that for our benefit, our gain, instead of being like, oh, well, this person over here has a reading disability, or they have, for example, they have poor eyesight, or, we're looking at the negative. And I feel like that negative, it stays with us, and it very much, even if we don't notice it, it impacts who we are and how we exist, and the confidence that we are able to sort of exude and perpetuate through the world.
Thank you for this great conversation that we have started today. And we can continue the conversation around Dr. Carpenter's work, but this next February presentation, Dr. Maxine brings him back. Janice will be bringing to us Indigenous pedagogy, a relational framework. And so it seems like a great follow-up to see additional perspectives on what we all want to do is help students live their strengths. So thank you all very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.